Today is the first installment of our four-part webinar series, Understanding Iowa's Changing Climate. And today we're going to be focusing on the relationship between climate and agriculture, given its importance in our state. We're excited to have you all here with us today and look forward to the conversation with our guest speaker, Dr. Laurie Nowatzke, and I look forward to hearing some of the research that she has been a part of over the past couple of years. Also, just want to make a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. Feel free to ask questions throughout the duration of the webinar. You can submit those questions through our question and answer portal at the bottom of your screen. It's two little chat bubbles. Feel free to ask throughout, and if it's something quick, we'll answer it throughout the presentation. Otherwise, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, and look forward to answering those as they come up. I'll also note that this is being recorded, and we will post the recording sometime tomorrow and send it out to everybody who was registered for the event. And that will include all of the slides from today's presentation. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and jump in. Sarah, would you mind moving to the next slide? Well, I'm going to start with a little bit of an overview of the Iowa Environmental Council for those of you that may not be familiar with our organization. We are a statewide nonprofit organization, and we are the largest and oldest environmental coalition in the state of Iowa. We are celebrating our 30th year anniversary this year, and we're looking forward to having a year of celebration of the work that our organization has done for clean water, clean energy, and climate resilience over the last several years. I think it's important in these conversations to also list out what some of our driving and guiding values are. A lot of our work is informed by science, data, and stories, and sometimes it's our role to educate and lead on these topics, and other times, more often, it's our role to learn from folks at the local level and across the state and follow their lead in driving environmental solutions across the state of Iowa. We are an inclusive and nonpartisan organization, and we take a lot of pride in listening to feedback from our members and from others in our nonprofit community and across the state, across sectors, as we develop solutions that work for Iowans. Overall, our mission is to build a just, sustainable, and healthy environment for future generations of Iowans. Next slide, please. So a little bit about me. This one's always a little uncomfortable for me, but I'm going to make it through. I think it's important because I want to get to know each of you just as well as you get to know us. So I serve as the Director of Climate Initiatives here at IEC. This is our newest program. We've had the program stood up for almost exactly a year now. And our focus, we'll talk more about it in the next slide, but it's really helping Iowans adapt to climate change, the impacts of climate change that we see here in the state. My background is at the intersection of energy, agriculture, and water as it relates to the climate change. And I'm committed to this work and meeting each of you and helping share information in a way that makes sense and that's usable to you across the state. Next slide, please. So I mentioned our Climate Initiatives program. Our overall mission is to build healthy and thriving communities. We do that by helping Iowans and their community leaders prepare for the impacts of climate change, which we'll talk more about today, and protecting our neighbors from harmful environmental pollution that we've identified across the state, whether that's industrial pollution or water pollution, all of the above. Our core objectives as a program help Iowans plan and prepare for climate risks and disasters that can threaten the lives of our neighbors and property across the state. We want to make sure that our communities are more resilient to extreme weather. We also, as I mentioned before, have a central focus on identifying, addressing, and reducing the impacts of climate change, as well as the health-based impacts of environmental pollution. So if it's air quality concerns or land contamination or water quality concerns, our program is really focused on getting into communities at the ground level and helping people identify and respond to these challenges. Next slide, please. So today we have a pretty brief agenda, straightforward. We are going to give you an overview of why agriculture is so important and relevant to this conversation about climate change and review how much, excuse me, of the state's economy is dependent upon agriculture. We're going to hear from Dr. Nowatzke on her research that she was doing over the past couple of years related to the direct impacts of climate change on Iowa's agricultural system. And then I'll wrap us up with some ways for you to get involved in our work and next steps for how you can be an advocate for Iowa's environment. And then after that, we'll have a question and answer session where Dr. Nowatzke and myself will be able to answer your questions about the topics we covered today. Next slide, please. So here's a brief overview of Iowa's agricultural dominance. We have about 36 million acres across the state total. About 30 million of that is in agricultural production, and we have about 147,000 acres of wetland. You know that probably all of you on this call know that we have a lot of large agricultural outputs from livestock such as hogs and cattle to crop production like corn, soybeans, oats, and other dairy products as well. We have some industrial agricultural processing facilities as well as machinery and electrical equipment. We are the nation's largest producer of corn-based ethanol as well. So this is just a little bit of the background and context that demonstrates why this conversation about climate change and agriculture is so important to our state. Next slide, please. Here's some more information. I'm not going to go through all of this. This is just to give you a better picture for those of you who might be approaching this topic for the first time. We have a lot of farms across the state of Iowa. We have over 86,000 across that 30 million acres. And we have a lot of livestock. You can see some of those numbers there with the top one being hogs, followed by turkeys and cattle for both beef and milk, and such as dairy cattle. And then close to my heart, having grown up on a sheep farm, is the sheep production here in the state of Iowa. Obviously, you drive anywhere around Iowa, you see the cornfields and soybean fields that we have. We have a lot of agricultural value that adds to our economy in that way. And I'll have you go to the next slide, Sarah. I'll go back one. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. So with that agricultural dominance, there are a number of environmental impacts that we have to recognize as a result of agriculture in our state. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is intentional, but this is the reality of where we live. So some of the water quality impacts are among the highest concerns that we see here at IEC. We all know that we have a nutrient pollution problem in our waterways with nitrates and phosphorus. That can lead to harmful algal blooms that make our water bodies, like our lakes, not advised to recreate in over the summer. We have our weekly water watch where we notify Iowans of this challenge and try to protect their families and their pets from what can be some really damaging pollution in that case. There are other concerns related to agriculture, including E. coli and other bacteria, fertilizer and pesticide spills. Those happen if you're on the DNR listserv. You see that happening what seems like every week or at least every other week. There's some type of fuel spill or pesticide or fertilizer impact reaching a water body, and our state responds to that afterwards. We also have to recognize that as we've grown more crops in the state of Iowa, we have less than 0.01% of our original prairie remaining in the state. So this has led to the clearing of natural lands, and that has a lot to do with our water quality challenges. The conversation today, though, however, is going to be focused more around the impact of climate change on agriculture, and then vice versa, climate change impacts on agriculture in the state. Agriculture is Iowa's largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, with about 31% of our statewide emissions coming from agriculture in Iowa. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Nowatzke. And I'm going to just give you a brief intro of who Dr. Nowatzke is. And she has a BS in biological sciences from Wright State University and a master's in environmental policy from Boston University. And then Go Cyclones has a PhD in rural sociology from Iowa State University. I'll let you describe sort of what position you're in now and how you want to approach that conversation. But I just want to say thank you for your service at the USDA Midwest Climate Hub over the past several years. That's where I first met Dr. Nowatzke, and been really impressed with her work. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thank you so much, Cody, and thank you everyone for being here. I think it's heartening to see so many folks signing on for a climate change discussion, especially given sort of the shifts and uncertainties in a lot of these conversations in our scientific and also sort of applied and civic action communities in the last few months. So Cody alluded to some shifts in my professional life recently, so I'll give you all the lowdown there. So until last week, I was with USDA Midwest Climate Hub based in Ames, Iowa. I had been there for about 3.5 years, and prior to that, I spent about 6 years with Iowa State Extension and the College of Ag and Life Sciences there, working on water quality research and outreach. My time at USDA was very fulfilling and I think a very productive time for our team, and so I think very fondly on that time. I was unfortunately one of the 15,000 USDA employees who took one of the 2 buyout programs that were offered this year for a deferred resignation, given a lot of the uncertainty and upcoming changes that are likely to happen at the agency in the coming weeks and months. So I left USDA about a week ago, just about, and as of Monday, I'm serving as a research specialist with the University of Iowa College of Public Health. So I will be working to support an interdisciplinary project on climate resilience in tribal communities and among women landowners in Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri. So I'm really excited to join that team. At Iowa, some really incredible scientists, researchers, practitioners, and also community members coming together for a really robust federally funded project funded through NOAA. So I hope we can continue doing that work and keep promoting these really important topics. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk about a couple of different things. So as a sociologist, my research typically tends to focus on kind of the human dimensions and human perspectives around climate change, especially among farmers and the agricultural community more broadly. But today I'm going to focus a lot more on the work we did at the Midwest Climate Hub to promote climate literacy in Iowa, how that impacts agriculture in the Midwest. And how we can kind of link sort of complex data, climate data sources with sort of on the ground impacts in ag and crop production. And so I'll talk a little bit about weather versus climate. These are 2 distinct concepts that I think many on this call are probably pretty aware of that distinction, but I often like to start with that so that we're all on the same page, given that they can be kind of conflated in some situations. We'll talk about climate change in Iowa. What have we measured and experienced and observed in Iowa in terms of our climate over the last few decades, the last century, and what do we expect to see in the future? I'll talk sort of interspersed throughout the impacts on agriculture as a result of these climate change both observations and sort of the projected future climate change. And then we'll talk about some resources and strategies for moving forward in response to this information. Oh, next slide, please. Sorry, I tried to change my slide. Thank you. So weather versus climate. Weather is generally describes the short-term conditions in the atmosphere. So this can be measured as far as really very short-term, minute-to-minute changes, real-time temperature or precipitation measurements. It could be hour-to-hour or day-to-day or even season-to-season. However, when we talk about weather, we're generally not describing anything beyond a couple weeks, maybe into the season. Climate, on the other hand, describes the average daily weather for an extended period in a location. And so I'll add to this too, it's not just the average, but also the expected variation that we might see. And so climate is really looking at a certain period of time and what that looks like year to year and what kinds of trends we're seeing in that. So kind of to sum that up, climate is what you expect and weather is what you get. Next slide, please. The overall average temperature, both in Iowa as well as in the US and globally, is on the rise. So since between 1880 and 2012, we saw a 2-degree average increase in our temperature globally. This is not the same everywhere you go. So Iowa, in fact, is showing kind of a lower average increase, but there are places throughout the US and the world that see higher increases in temperature over that time period. And but I think that really the main takeaway is that with the exception of a few places on the globe, we are seeing this global increase over time pretty much ubiquitously. Next slide, please. There are some kind of more felt impacts of that as far as our seasonal changes. So one of those, which we can kind of observe really clearly in Iowa, is the change in the growing season length. Typically, we describe the growing season length as the time between the last freeze in the late winter or early spring and the first frost in the fall or early winter at the end of the season. So in Iowa, what we're seeing over the course of the last century or so is an increase of the growing season length by about 8 to 12 days. And it can vary county to county, but generally that's what we've measured. And so that can really show a lot of impacts for those transitional periods in the spring and the fall. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we go along here. Next slide, please. Temperature is not the only thing that's changing. We're also seeing changes in precipitation, both the amount and the timing. So we are seeing an increased precipitation overall in Iowa, and I'll show a little more data about that as we get further on. But also, that's not happening evenly across the year. So we're seeing depending on where you are in the state, winter and fall can be getting wetter or drier, depending on where you are, but spring and summer are generally getting wetter on average over the course of the last few decades. Next slide, please. So there's several things we want to think about when it comes to climate in Iowa. First is the direct impacts. So we can measure and also project the temperatures and how those are changing year to year in Iowa. All of our seasons are warming. Spring and winter are especially warming at a pretty rapid rate compared with the other seasons. And February, which we've all experienced in the last few years, has been especially, well, it says except February. I got to look into that, but we have had some really markedly warmer Februaries each year in the last several years. As far as rainfall goes, we are seeing really direct impacts there as well. So both the change in timing, heavier downpours, more rainfall overall, but it really is concentrating in shorter time frames compared with past decades. So we're especially getting a wetter spring, and the fall in some parts of Iowa is also getting wetter. We have indirect impacts as a result of this. So Cody referenced some of the environmental impacts that we're seeing in Iowa as a result of both climate and non-climate related things, but I want to point out that climate change can be exacerbating a lot of those environmental impacts that we're seeing in Iowa. So as a result of precipitation changes, especially the timing during times when our fields are bare or have minimal vegetation in them, we're seeing more soil erosion, runoff of water on those fields, flooding, and delayed field work. And that has been really impacting on-farm management in Iowa. We're seeing a depletion of soil moisture in the summer, generally over the years. So that is leading to agricultural drought, so kind of minimized availability of water when the crops need it most. We're seeing an increase in the quantity of livestock forage, but in some cases that quality of the forage, even though it's increasing in quantity, the quality is decreasing. And that's really concerning. And that can be owed to various temperature shifts, but also for the shifts in precipitation timing as well. And in the case of sort of the western part of the state and heading into Nebraska, we're seeing expansion of woody species in our grasslands, but also more generally across the state, an expansion of weeds and also pests, which we'll talk about as well as a result of some of these seasonal shifts. There are many resources in Iowa. So just due to the nature of my most recent position until last week, a lot of what I'm showing you here today are federal resources that either have been or are still available as far as climate data and impacts go. But there's a lot of in-state resources as well. So we do have an environmental mesonet in Iowa, which is housed at the Iowa State University on their website. We also have an Iowa Climatology Bureau, which is our state climatologist, Justin Glisson, is housed in the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship. So he's a fantastic resource as well. There's others that are more regional. So we have the National Drought Mitigation Center, which helps operate the U.S. Drought Monitor. And we have the NOAA resources like a climate resilience toolkit and several other resources that you'll see along the way on my slides here too. And as I mentioned, the USDA Midwest Climate Hub is still, fully operational, if not a little bit lower capacity right now. So they're based in Ames and a fantastic resource. A lot of climatologists as well as social scientists working to share a lot of these resources. We also, I want to point out that there's historically underserved communities in Iowa, and both in Iowa as well as nationwide, they are typically more at risk of climate change impacts. So I won't talk a lot about the human dimensions today outside of sort of agricultural production, our predominant agricultural production, but just want to point out that there's a lot of conversations to be had there, and a lot of the work I'll be doing with researchers at Iowa and Iowa State University are working on sort of understanding these dynamics as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to dig into the climate data a little more and talk about how this is impacting agriculture a little more specifically. A lot of these charts I do want to point out come from Climate at a Glance, which is a really helpful tool from NOAA. As a bit of a disclaimer, I am not a climatologist. I am a sociologist. So when I started my role with USDA, I was not aware of a lot of the places we can get a lot of this observed climate data and projection data. So I encourage you, if you are looking for this kind of information and specific graphs and data, to kind of take note of some of the resources that are indicated on the slides, or revisit the slides when they're posted another time, because I'm not so sure that, a lot of folks who don't work directly in the climate world know that a lot of these are available. And so I'm definitely out to spread the word a little bit, because I do think they're very helpful. So Climate at a Glance from NOAA allows us to look at trends over time in average temperature, as well as maximums, minimums, other types of indicators. So the Iowa's average temperature overall for the whole year, this top graph, is increasing over time at a few tenths of a degrees per decade. And you can see, though, there's still quite a lot of variation, and that's due to kind of natural weather variability, but in this greater kind of context of overall warming. Again, this is not happening evenly across the seasons or throughout the year. So we're seeing some increase in winter temperature. That's the bottom left graph. December to February each year is getting generally warmer and trending that direction. And spring, we're seeing a little bit of warming, but it's not happening at quite the same rate. So there's quite a lot of variation here, but we do get that kind of overall increase on average annual temperature each year. Next slide. There are also changes with when, like the diurnal pattern. So when those are we seeing most of the warming happening during the day or during the night? And I'll give that one example here. So in the wintertime, especially, we're seeing a lot of fewer cold nights. So do you mind clicking the arrow? I wonder if there's a graphic not popping up here. There we go. Thank you. So we're in the wintertime, we're getting fewer cold nights over time. So an overall decrease. You'll notice that in the last few decades, since about 1990 or the early 80s, a lot of those bars are below that century average. And so we're seeing fewer cold nights. And so that can be attributed, that a lot of the warming in the winter can be attributed to this change in the nighttime lows. And that has a lot of impacts as far as our weather dynamics and sort of vegetation and snowpack response in the winter and what winter looks like in Iowa. But there's also some more really felt impacts here as well. So we are seeing tick populations rising in Iowa. And of course, ticks transmit diseases to both humans and livestock. And we are seeing an increase in observed Lyme disease case counts over time. And so that is something that is concerning, and of course, something we track, and an indicator of that change in the winter temperature, because ticks are kind of moving northward or they're overwintering. It's also an indicator of what could be happening with other pests as well. So we're seeing other like crop pests or ecological pests that are showing up in Iowa that maybe hadn't earlier or hadn't in previous decades. And so these pest impacts are really concerning, both for human and livestock health, but also for crop physiology and pathology as well. So that's where we, we're really kind of experiencing some of those changes in temperature and how that's affecting our day-to-day. Next slide, please. Actually, if you can go to the previous slide. Thank you. So one other thing I wanted to point out is this sort of diurnal cycle and how those changes are felt. It's not just winter either. So something that kind of surprised me as I began to dig into climate data and interact more closely with climatologists was that our summer warming in Iowa is not driven by our daytime temperatures. So summer is very hot in July and August in Iowa, but our daytime temperatures are pretty stable. In fact, where we're seeing a lot of warming in the summer is due to warmer nights in the summer. So that is having a lot of impacts on both our humidity dynamics each summer in Iowa, but also on livestock health and human health and comfort. That can really impact our reliance on air conditioning and cooling, and also make it really difficult to maintain livestock health during really hot spells in the summer. So again, just kind of trying to express these unexpected dynamics and variation that are occurring within this warming trend. Next slide. Thank you. Aside from temperature, as we've mentioned earlier, we're also seeing changes in precipitation. So Iowa generally is getting wetter overall. We're seeing more precipitation annually than we did a few decades ago. So that is happening mostly in spring and fall. We're seeing very wet April and October periods, and a lot of kind of more precipitation in those times. And so the issue that has for agriculture, for those of you who work with farmers or work in that space, would recognize that April and October are really big field seasons. And something that when I was at the Climate Hub, what we heard a lot about was the challenge that presents for field work and planning field work. So with a really wet April, really wet October becoming more and more likely each year, it can make it really hard to get into the field when you need to, and to plan for the right sort of crop management, cover crop termination, issues like that. So that's definitely been affecting our farms pretty acutely over the last few decades. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, this increase in precipitation is not happening sort of gently and generally across the season. What we're seeing is sort of a concentration into shorter time periods when this precipitation is occurring. So this chart shows the prevalence of 2-inch precipitation events. So when we have more than 2 inches of precipitation in one day. And so we're seeing an increase in the number of days that we get those really heavy precipitation events. So overall, heavy downpours are becoming more common and could be occurring more readily in times when we don't have vegetation on our fields, which makes soil more vulnerable, makes us more prone to runoff and difficulty with flood management as well. Next slide. So our climate future really looks like the trends that we've seen over the last few decades will persist into the future. So we're going to see more variability with an increase in these extreme events. So you can see here flooded fields on the left, but also coupled with and interspersed with drought impacted crops in the photo on the right. Next slide, please. Some recent memory for some of you to draw on is some spring flooding events that we've had. So we are seeing sort of those extreme spring events happening, especially around some of our major riverine systems in Iowa. I think all of us can recall at least a few major flooding events that have occurred in the last decade or so in Iowa. I've been here about 10 years, and I myself can draw on a few memories of some pretty extreme flooding events, and we are seeing these becoming more common and more difficult to manage as well for our infrastructure as well as for our farms. Next slide. But just because we're having more precipitation overall doesn't mean that we're mitigating drought necessarily. So drought still happens, and in fact is in some cases becoming more intense over time. So this chart here shows the percentage of land area in Iowa that falls under one of the US drought monitor categories. So the bright yellow is sort of the D0, which is kind of abnormally dry periods. And then as you get darker into the darker red, you hit D4, which is a more severe drought, which we tend to see somewhat regularly recently in Northwest Iowa, especially, which tends to be kind of vulnerable to that extreme drought period. Next slide, please. So as a result of these dynamics where we're seeing a lot more precipitation happening in the springtime when there isn't vegetation on a lot of our cropland, but also more heat and nighttime heat and drought in the summer, we're seeing summer soil moisture deficits potentially becoming more common, and they might increase over time. So with these increased summer temperatures and no clear change in summer rainfall, we generally see an increase in the evapotranspiration, or the amount of evaporation coming off of plants and the soil during that time, and then as a result, potentially decreased soil moisture. So soil moisture deficits have been a major concern in several of the recent years, and we do expect that is a risk moving forward. Next slide. So just as a bit of like climate change 101, why are these changes happening? So many of you have probably heard about the greenhouse effect and how greenhouse gases contribute to our climate change and drive climate change on Earth. So just to kind of give a recap of how this system is functioning, the Earth's atmosphere takes in solar radiation, and in a more typical like balance or stasis, we would have some of that heat going out and some of it being trapped by the atmosphere. But as we emit more greenhouse gases into our atmosphere, they trap a lot of that solar radiation and the radiation from the Earth. And so more of that heat gets trapped within the atmosphere and continues to reflect within our atmosphere, and less of that radiation leaves the atmosphere into space. And so that's how we're experiencing these kind of in a simplified way, how we're experiencing these increases in temperature. And of course, as a complex system, that then has sort of these feedback loops and reactions that affect our precipitation patterns and our polar ice caps, and how that might impact oceans and land as well. So with less greenhouse gas emissions, we could potentially lower the amount of greenhouse gas effect that's happening over time. Next slide. So the concentration of greenhouse gases since the year zero, based on polar ice cores and other kind of proxy data. We're seeing increases in carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. There are other greenhouse gases as well, but these are sort of the three of most concern. And so right around the time of the Industrial Revolution and the advent of the automobile, we see a massive increase in greenhouse gas emissions globally. Next slide. So 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions come in the form of carbon dioxide, but as I said, methane and nitrous oxide are also major contributors. As far as ag goes, all three of those are a concern. So nationally, agriculture contributes about 10% of the US emissions. As Cody mentioned earlier, that is a higher proportion for Iowa. And I do want to point out too that several of these other sectors have shown decreasing greenhouse gas emissions over time. As a result, the agriculture share of the pie has increased. So that percentage is increasing slightly over time, but the total emissions has been relatively stable. Next slide. So our temperature has risen along with these levels of greenhouse gases. So if you look at that line where the bars are coming out of, that's sort of the average global temperature since 1880. And these the blue bars show sort of a decrease from that average temperature in that year, and then the red bars show an increase from that average temperature. So we are seeing above average global temperatures really since 1980 and pretty predominantly since 1940 or so. Next slide. Oh, and I'll point out, sorry, with that circle on the last slide, that we are seeing continuing to see rises in temperature. So we expect to see that moving into the future as well. Next slide, thank you. One way that climate change is impacting us economically is through these billion-dollar disasters. So NOAA currently tracks billion-dollar disasters, which are generally these natural disasters that have major economic impact where they occur. Next slide, please. We are seeing these increasing over time. So this is the chart for Iowa. If you're interested in this data, you can kind of filter by type of event or by geographic area. And you can really see that a lot of severe storms as well as drought impacts are measurably showing up on an increasing basis, as well as some other natural events as well. Next slide. So as far as observed and projected temperature, this chart is showing the line shows the observed temperature year to year. And so the gray bar shows sort of like how our climate models predict that past work. So our models do predict the observed data alongside it. So we do see sort of an increase over time, but because of this sort of chain reaction and effect of increasing emissions, we do expect to see acceleration of temperature change, even under lower emission scenarios. But in cases where we continue to have high emissions, we will start to see even more rapid temperature change according to several climate models moving forward. And this is for Iowa specifically. Thank you. So now we're done with the bleak aspects, I suppose. I do want to talk about some of the available resources and action points for Iowa, especially as it relates to agriculture. So I'll highlight my previous team here, the USDA Midwest Climate Hub. Every US state and territory falls under a climate hub, and Iowa falls under two. So Iowa's ag-related issues are generally handled by the Midwest Climate Hub, and then forestry-related issues are handled by the Northern Forest Climate Hub, which is located in Houghton, Michigan at Michigan Tech University. So two USDA teams plus several others, but really two hubs that are trying to kind of grapple with how climate is impacting these land management issues and what we can do about it moving forward. Next slide. So I do want to talk a bit about climate smart agriculture. So how can agriculture respond to this information? I want to point out that agriculture is a kind of a interesting case in that it's contributing substantially to climate change occurrence, but it's also in turn directly affected by climate change as well. So really farmers can feel the impacts and weather changes over time and do have that lived experience. And so in light of that, there are several kind of scientific approaches, but also just general discussions around how to adapt to climate change. In other words, how can agriculture respond and kind of reduce the impacts from climate change and increased extreme weather, but also mitigate climate change? How can agriculture reduce its greenhouse gas emissions or sequester carbon and thereby reduce its contribution to climate change as well? So just want to point out here that, this is just a bit of kind of climate terminology, but mitigation addresses the causes of climate change, but adaptation and resilience can address the consequences of climate change. So I see this as sort of like a 3-point structure here. We've called these the 3 pillars of climate smart agriculture, and these have been defined by several major institutions like the Food and Ag Organization of the UN and several others. But one way to think about climate smart ag is adaptation to extreme weather, the mitigation of greenhouse gases, either through carbon sequestration or reduced emissions. And then the bottom of that triangle, maintaining or increasing productivity moving forward. Thank you, Cody. I've got a few more slides, so I should hit 5 minutes. All right, next slide. So where can we start the conversation about climate-informed agriculture or climate-smart agriculture? So one thing, and I will say that this slide comes from one of our colleagues in NRCS, who was Adam Reed, who helps to kind of promote climate-related conversations in NRCS and technical assistance for farmers in Iowa and other states in the Midwest. So first, we can understand where production is most vulnerable. So lowlands, steep slopes, poor soils, or overgrazing, where we have pastures. Will current practices be sufficient to address the extremes and changes in a changing climate? And I'd say in most cases, in our kind of conventional and predominant agricultural practices, there are some insufficiencies there that present some vulnerabilities to climate change and extreme weather. And we can encourage goal-oriented planning and iterative evaluation of practices and outcomes. I bring this up because I've worked in several programs with farmers and agricultural advisors on on-farm planning for adaptation and mitigation. And it really, it can be kind of intensive and require a lot of sort of cyclical approaches to addressing on-farm concerns, but it can really be an opening for talking about these issues with farmers. So there are some strategies for approaching climate smart agriculture in Iowa. So first would be maximizing continuous living roots. So that could either be through perennial crops or land retirement, but it can also be through like relay cropping, cover cropping, adding forage into parts of your operation. So really trying to kind of minimize the amount of time that a field does not have vegetation on it. You can minimize disturbance, so no-till and reduced tillage, reduced traffic overall in a field can minimize the disturbance to the soil, but it can also reduce diesel usage on a farm, which reduces greenhouse gas emissions. Maximizing biodiversity, so introducing additional crop rotations, rotational grazing, integrated pest management. There are several strategies for how we can promote climate resilience through increased vegetative diversity on a farm. and maximizing soil cover. So that could be through living roots, but it can also be through mulching, reduced tillage, green manures, other things as well. So this is just a sampling of a lot of the practices that are available to Iowa farmers to consider in their operations. And I want to point out that several of these really do intersect other environmental concerns. So a lot of these align with water quality improvement efforts on farms in Iowa, and could also promote like wildlife habitat and other things as well. Next slide. I do want to point out too, the 5th National Climate Assessment is a fantastic resource. So it came out in 2023. The 6th National Climate Assessment was underway until about 2 weeks ago. It is required by law, so we expect some form of a 6th National Climate Assessment to be put together at some point. I will say that I was a co-author of the 6th National Climate Assessment, and all of us volunteer authors hundreds of scientists were dismissed last week by the administration, but there are efforts underway in the Midwest to generate some kind of parallel climate assessment outside of this national government system so that we can still put out a Midwest climate assessment in some form in the coming years. So I want to point everyone to that because it has not only fantastic data and information related to all sectors, but it also has tribal perspectives included, as well as art and poetry that have been developed to pair with the scientific data there. Next slide. And finally, I think this might be kind of the inspiration for the webinar overall, but a lot of this information is captured in this report from the Midwest Climate Hub and several Iowa State partners and many other partners as well. Last year, we put out a climate change impacts on Iowa agriculture white paper, and it talks about a lot of these changes that I've talked about today, but also pulls in a lot of extension and agricultural advising expertise on how to adapt on a farm to climate change moving forward. So I encourage you all to check out that resource as well. Next slide. I believe that's it. Yes, and I do want to acknowledge these folks in the bottom right corner there on my last slide, because these slides did not, come out of nowhere in the last few weeks. They were adapted from lots of previous presentations and work that I've done with several folks, many of whom are on this webinar today. So thank you. I'll pass it back to you, Cody.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nowatzke, for that. I have just a few more resources to share, so I'm going to speed through them really quickly and kind of focus on what you can do after learning this information. I think one of the biggest things that we can offer as an organization is education, learning more about the impacts through webinars like this one and other resources. If you want to move to the next one. We also have our climate change and environmental health in Iowa map. This is a tool that you can use to learn about pollution across your community, efforts to protect vulnerable members of your community, just learn a lot more about what the climate and environmental risks are. It also includes racial information, health information, all from federal data sets, which are no longer available. Next slide, please. We also have some ag-related indicators of climate change and its impact on Iowa agriculture in the map, and I'll have you go to that next one as well. So this first one I wanted to highlight is the share of properties at risk of flood over the next 30 years. 2 notes about what you see here. The color coding allows us to see in Iowa where this risk is the highest. So the darker blue is the highest. But the numbers you see on the bottom right in this legend are federal numbers. So you can see that Iowa, most of Iowa, ranks in the 75th percentile up to the 97th percentile across the entire country for this risk, which is predicted to be worse by climate change. Next slide, please. We also have an often unconsidered example of wildfire risk in the state of Iowa. You can see that it varies a lot across the state. It's not something I really had on my radar quite as much, but you can see again, these color coding, the darker reds and oranges show us that some communities in Iowa are ranked in the 83rd to 99th percentile nationally for the risk of wildfire over the next 30 years. A lot of them are caused by the conditions that Laurie just mentioned. Next slide. And this is ultimately one of the economic indicators. This is the amount of predicted agricultural value lost over the next 30 years due to natural disasters. again, caused by climate change, making these more extreme. So these communities in the dark green, most of Iowa, rank in the 75th to 96th percentile nationally for this challenge. Next slide, please. So you can also support our work. You can connect with our organization, and we're always happy to discuss and converse more about these impacts. You can follow us on social media where we post a lot about these types of challenges, and then also advocate in your community. Next slide, please. And that's what this last one is. You can share your presentation with this presentation with your local officials, with your state and state representatives and senators. Sign up for our legislative work to engage on these topics as we do every year up at the State House, and find ways to implement changes in your community. And with that, I just want to say thank you. And again, a reminder, these slides and the webinar recording will be available for you to view later and to share. And with that, I'm going to open it up for the questions. We've got two here, and Laurie, I'm going to kick them over to you. So the first one is from Amy. It says, insurance studies have shown that a high percentage, well in excess of 50% of the increase in the so-called billion-dollar disasters can be explained by a combination of inflation and increased exposures, such as more houses, bigger houses, et cetera. Were your numbers deflated for those factors? Do you feel comfortable answering that?
I think so, yeah, and you bring up a really complex and great point, Amy. I'll point out that first off, that the NOAA data on billion-dollar disasters is adjusted for inflation as far as the value of the dollar. That said, I think you're right that in many geographic areas, this increase in value could be attributed to the fact that a natural disaster might hit a place that's been more developed over time, right? So there's more property, more infrastructure there. That said, I do think in Iowa, we can be confident in saying that because of the prevalence of our cropland and the amount of space our cropland and agricultural land takes up, that that increase in value can be attributed heavily to the increase in events itself. That said, it could, of course, be also be due to like increased crop value or things, or like farm infrastructure value. But those are great points. But I'd be interested in kind of digging into that further. But my understanding is that NOAA does take some of that into account. I'm just not sure to what extent. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, and there is a notable increase, as Laurie showed, in the number of billion-dollar disasters, and those, didn't happen near as much. And I do think that you're correct on the inflation adjustment. So just to reiterate that, there's another question here that I'm going to broaden out just a little bit, asking your thoughts on carbon sequestration benefits from using cover crops or other soil health practices. I think this can be broadened out to be more about nature-based solutions like vegetation restoration, cover crops, soil health, of course. Some of those no-till practices you mentioned, investing in the soil structure and quality and restoring natural spaces would be another one. Planting trees would be another example. Can you speak to some of the science behind that and whether or not this is a long-term strategy?
Yeah. Thanks for this question to this anonymous person. This is also very complex, and I will say that some of the science is still out, right? We need to gather more of that information. A lot of studies have been done that still need to be kind of synthesized. And at the time I left the Midwest Climate Hub, there's a team there working on that, and several major grant projects that are dedicated to that across several institutions in the Midwest. So I'll say this work's being continued. That said, as far as carbon sequestration in Iowa, one thing, and I'll preface this by saying I'm not a soil scientist, but I talk to a lot of soil scientists. And my understanding is that there are some limitations as far as carbon sequestration in Iowa, especially from some of these shorter term practices like cover crops. We it would be difficult to increase the soil organic matter in Iowa soils substantially enough to like draw down large amounts of carbon. That said, Carbon can be stored not just in the soil, but also in perennial vegetation itself. So trees store a huge amount of carbon, as well as prairie and other perennial crops. And so I would say that, soil health for carbon sequestration is one tool that likely has a lot of caveats and limitations to it, especially in our high carbon soils. But there's lots of other strategies related to perennial crops and perennial vegetation that could draw down carbon. I will also add that soil health practices in general are very well documented for climate adaptation. So responding to those extreme weather events, we can increase water holding capacity, increase water infiltration, decrease overall, soil erosion. So I'd say like it's one piece in a pretty large toolbox that we're still trying to understand more clearly and quantify. I
Yeah,
hope
thank
that
you for
answered the
that.
question. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the distinction between sequestration, which is a mitigation action, and then some of the adaptation of water holding capacity, perhaps improving productivity of the soil, that actually would be, some adaptation thing as you consider the impacts of extreme heat or other things in that area. I think largely I've heard the same thing, Dr. Nowatzke, about the science sort of still being inconclusive or at least new on the long-term value of the nature-based solutions that don't stay for a long time. So if you're planting trees or prairies, it's sequestering that carbon while it's living. Whereas carbon sequestration and cover crops, having it be a temporary living root source that's then terminated for agricultural production, that might be a seasonal sequestration, I guess. I don't want to get too far into the terminology
Sure.
I don't understand, but I think that's one option to consider there too. So it's a great point to distinguish between the two. You have talked a little bit with Fatima about the increasing agricultural greenhouse gas emissions rate. And as we have our final minute here, I'm wondering if you want to add any comments about that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, thank you, Fatima, for bringing that up. And I do appreciate that Fatima has brought up the distinction between carbon dioxide and N2O, which are both major agricultural sources of greenhouse gases, or from agricultural sources. And I did put a link in one of the answered questions, and Fatima has also shared another study. So I'll just point out that the EPA data that I linked talks about CO2 equivalent, and so that accounts for the fact that N2O has higher greenhouse gas potential, but puts it kind of on par with CO2 for the sake of this chart. But Fatima has linked to kind of some additional looks at that N2O discussion. So there's definitely a lot of nuance there, but still points out that there's, greenhouse gas emissions are still a major concern in the agricultural sector.
Well, I want to just say thank you to you, Dr. Nowatzke, for your time and for the information. I want to say thank you again to each of the attendees today for your attention and your engagement in this important topic. We look forward to hosting additional webinars in the coming months. I believe we're hosting one in July, particularly around the areas of water resources and climate change. So stay tuned for that. And with that, I'm just going to go ahead and wrap up here and say thanks again for attending.
Thanks for having me.